Not since the Great Depression in the 1930s has the working class experienced such an assault on its living standards, rights, and conditions of work. What is striking about it is the fact that everything that workers have won is all back on the table, and all at once. It is the perfect storm. Engels wrote, "The organization of the workers and their constantly growing resistance will possibly check the increase of misery to a certain extent. However, what certainly does increase is the insecurity of existence." Isn't this sense of insecurity the condition of every section of the working class today? Since the transitory gains won in the late 1990s, which only partly compensated for earlier reversals and losses, average real wages have been declining. The relatively low official unemployment rate masks the substantial hidden unemployment rate. Working families have maintained living standards only because of consumer credit, longer hours of work, and by turning every family member into a wage earner. The entry of women into the workforce in record numbers over the past 30 years is the most notable feature of this trend. While the right wing hails the traditional patriarchal family unit, with a woman bearing children and performing unpaid labor to reproduce male labor power for a new bout of fresh exploitation, the logic of the right wing's policies and the deeper transformations in the system of capitalism are forcing women into the workplace where they are forced to occupy subordinate and underpaid positions. Bankruptcies are also rising, and the new bankruptcy law and rising rates for consumer debt will force millions into a form of indentured servitude. And the pension crisis, as some of our own comrades know, is galloping across industries and decimating working class communities. While this brutal offensive is class-wide in scope, the decline in living standards falls especially hard on women, young people, industrial workers, African American, Latino, and other racially and nationally oppressed workers and immigrants. NAFTA and other trade agreements have resulted in a great increase in immigrant workers who are ruthlessly exploited, have no rights, and are increasingly under legal pressure, and live separated from their families, often for long periods of time. The attack on living standards has coincided with an equally vicious attack on working conditions. Union rights have been gutted and workplace safety sabotaged. The pace of work has been intensified and work rules have been trashed. Jobs are combined left and right. The flip side of this coin is that corporate profits are astronomically high and the wealthiest of the wealthy are making out like bandits. The deteriorating conditions of the U.S. working class are not new, however. If anything, what I've just described continues the trend that began more than quarter century ago. There have been moments when the working class won some gains, to be sure, but the graph line has been either flat or downward. While much of this is attributable to the new stage of capitalist globalization and development, it is also the result of the economic policies of successive administrations. Capitalist globalization is an objective process, but its particular trajectory and particular impacts are in no small measure a political process. That is, they depend upon the ability of one or another section of the capitalist class to utilize the state and global institutions, as well as its financial power, to advance its interest, while at the same time reducing working people's living standards and hollowing out their political and organizational bases of power. Some call this neoliberalism, and in its neoconservative, ultra-right incarnation, This policy has been pursued with a vengeance, but more about that in a moment. While the reasons for this go beyond the scope of this report, suffice it to say that an old regime of accumulation and regulation of the economy and labor power has been supplanted by a new regime. And the transition from one to another occurs in a world capitalist economy that is saturated with excess commodities, unable to generate a sustained and robust economic expansion, and experiencing increasing instability. As you would expect, this transformation of the conditions of accumulation and regulation has transformed the conditions and heightened the intensity of the class struggle. So far, these changes have been to the advantage of capital. So much so that the owners of capital are setting aside the old social contract between labor and capital, as limited as it was, in favor of a new contract in which labor is virtually stripped of any rights. And since the election of Reagan, the recasting of the labor-capital relationship in capital's favor has been immeasurably aided by the ascendancy of the right-wing neoconservatism in our country, which from the very start has employed the full coercive power of the state, legislative, legal, institutional, regulatory, financial, and force itself to fracture and weaken the working class and its organized sector. Early on, the architects of this policy stated straight out that their aim was a union-free environment. These neoconservative attacks on labor haven't taken place in isolation, but rather they have been bundled up with a generalized assault on democratic rights, and especially the rights and conditions of racially oppressed communities